Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Holly Fry.
And I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And today we are continuing our discussion of campaign finance in the United States and the ways that money has been collected and spent and the efforts to regulate it. As I said on the last one, I find a lot of this depressing. Because it just becomes a corruption party. We left off with the McKinley campaign of 1896, which got a lot of contributions and was the subject of many accusations of corrupt finance practices. So today, we're going to start by segueing into things by talking about the man who became president when McKinley was assassinated 6 months into his second term as president, and that is Theodore Roosevelt.
So when Theodore Roosevelt ran for re-election in 1904, a fundraising scandal arose around his campaign. At this point, collecting donations from supportive voters had become commonplace, but it was discovered that the Roosevelt campaign had a lot of money coming in from corporate donors. Specifically, insurance companies had given very large amounts of money to his campaign, and they had done so in prior Republican campaigns. This came on the heels of articles in the press suggesting that Roosevelt, who claimed to be antitrust, was in fact supported by various corporate trusts. A write-up in the Freeport Bulletin of Freeport, Illinois on October 2nd, 1904 outlined the likely donations, and it concluded with, quote, "Of course, the Beef Trust and all other trusts will support Roosevelt, and a truthful answer to the New York World's inquiries with reference to their respective contributions would make interesting campaign literature."
In response, Roosevelt, who won the election, mentioned in multiple addresses to Congress in 1905 that campaign finance had to be reformed. In December of 1905, he stated, quote, "In political campaigns in a country as large and populous as ours, it is inevitable that there should be much expense of an entirely legitimate kind. This, of course, means that many contributions, and some of them of large size, must be made. And as a matter of fact, in any big political contest, such contributions are always made to both sides. It is entirely proper both to give and receive them unless there is an improper motive connected with either gift or reception." Later in that same speech, he continued, quote, "All contributions by corporations to any political committee or for any political purpose should be forbidden by law. Directors should not be permitted to use stockholders' money for such purposes, and, moreover, a prohibition of this kind would be, as far as it went, an effective method of stopping the evils aimed at in corrupt practices acts." In 1906, Senator Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina introduced legislation banning corporate campaign contributions. The Tillman Act was signed into law by Theodore Roosevelt on January 26, 1907.
The next move by Congress that was intended to advance campaign finance reform was the Federal Corrupt Practices Act, also known as the Publicity Act, which passed in 1910. This act instituted a regulation that required candidates for the House of Representatives to account for their campaign finances and disclose their fundraising and donation details. That same act was amended in 1911 to extend the same requirement to senatorial campaigns.
In addition to requiring full disclosure of all monies contributed and collected for campaigns, the Federal Corrupt Practices Act also introduced a cap to the amount that could be spent on a candidate's campaign. For candidates running for seats in the House, that cap was $5,000. For candidates running for Senate, the cap was $10,000. Those numbers could be lower if there was a state law in the state the candidate was running that set a lower cap. If that was the case, the state law, the lower amount, set the limit.
10 years after the caps were put in place for senatorial candidates, Truman Handy Newberry was convicted of violating the Federal Corrupt Practices Act. The accusations against him began when he soundly beat Henry Ford in the 1918 primary for a senator seat in Michigan. He had gone on to win that seat. Ford put the might of his wealth and influence behind pushing for an investigation because he did not believe that Newberry should have beaten him, thanks to Ford obviously having very extensive name recognition. That investigation revealed that Newberry had spent $100,000 on the campaign and had been found to have some irregularities in his election spending.
But Newberry appealed the judgment, and his case ended up before the Supreme Court. Their ruling was that under the Constitution, Congress did not have the power to regulate spending on primaries. The guilty verdict in the earlier case was overturned, and Newberry was determined to be entitled to the Senate seat that he had won in the campaign after he had won the primary, although he was kind of chastised for spending so much. The issue of whether or not Congress could weigh in on how primaries were conducted regarding election finance would come up again a couple of decades later, and we're going to talk about that in just a bit.
In 1925, the Federal Corrupt Practices Act was amended again. At that point, it became a requirement for any campaign contribution greater than $100 to be reported. Additionally, campaigns had to account for all of their contributions and spending.
All of this regulation up to this point seemed like a pretty great idea on paper. Of course, there needed to be laws about donations to curb money coming into campaigns with strings attached that included the expectation of favorable legislation for the donator. But there really wasn't a system in place to enforce any of this. In the case of Ford and Newberry, for example, the investigation really only got going because Henry Ford was a prominent person who really pushed for it. Nobody else had flagged it because there wasn't anybody to cover this stuff. And there were always ways for people to get around regulations and lax enforcement of those regulations, even once they were reported. The $100 reporting limit in the 1925 revision of the FCPA did not include any penalties for campaigns that failed to file their required reports. It's like, you have to do this, or else. Shrug, there was nothing that was going to happen to them. Additionally, people could easily donate multiple times in amounts less than $100 or $100 at a time, making up multiple hundreds if they claimed they were donating on behalf of different committees. They would just say, this is a donation from this committee, and then it would sail right through.
In the early 1940s, political action committees, or PACs, formed as a way to skirt the earlier regulations that made it illegal for corporate entities to donate to campaigns. By forming these associations, companies could leverage their size by asking employees to donate to create a voluntary fund. Folks may have experienced this in their working lives today.
Yep.
This workaround was also adopted by unions and trade organizations. This came on the heels of the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act. That sounds like it wouldn't have anything to do with campaign finance, but it did. The major portion of the act enabled the president to seize plants that were part of war production and manage those plants. The act was catalyzed by a massive number of strikes, about 1,200, that had taken place in the year and a half starting in December of 1941. The concern, of course, was that if a plant producing material vital to the war effort went on strike, it could negatively impact the United States in World War II.
President Franklin Delano Roosevelt vetoed the bill. In his comments on the bill, he stated, quote, "I am unalterably opposed to strikes in wartime. I do not hesitate to use the powers of government to prevent them." But he then outlined his various issues with the bill as it stood and noted that he really thought it was going to create more problems than it solved before concluding with, quote, "I recognize that this bill has an entirely praiseworthy purpose to ensure full war production, but I am convinced that Section 8 will produce strikes in vital war plants which otherwise would not occur. Therefore, I could not properly discharge the duties of my office if I were to approve."
But the section related to campaign contributions was in Section 9, and FDR had issues with that as well, writing, quote, "Section 9 of the bill prohibits for the period of the war political contributions by labor organizations. This provision obviously has no relevancy to a bill prohibiting strikes during the war in plants operated by the government or to a War Labor Disputes Act. If there be merit in the prohibition, it should not be confined to wartime, and careful consideration should be given to the appropriateness of extending the prohibition to other nonprofit organizations. Despite the president's veto, the bill passed through a congressional override. In 1947, this wartime legislation became permanent with the passing of the Taft-Hartley Act.
In 1944, the Congress of Industrial Organization, or CIO for short, formed the first political action committee. The CIO, which formed in 1935, was a federation of workers' unions that included groups from both the U.S. and Canada. Since unions couldn't donate to political campaigns, the CIO PAC created an organization through which large numbers of workers who were members of the affiliated unions could pool their money into one large resource to put behind the candidates they felt aligned with their goals and desires.
In a moment, we'll return to that issue of whether or not Congress could get involved in how primaries ran. But first, we will pause for a sponsor break.
Going back to that issue of Congress regulating primaries. In 1944, a legal battle led to the Supreme Court reversing its earlier position that Congress couldn't make laws about how primaries were run. That case was Smith versus Allwright, and the issue at hand was racial discrimination. As far back as 1923, the Texas Democratic Party had limited voting in primary elections to white voters only. You will sometimes see these referred to in textbooks or history books as white primaries. This was made possible because of a state law that enabled political parties to operate their primaries with their own rules as they saw fit. But a black dentist named Lonnie E. Smith pursued the issue legally as a clear instance of racial discrimination in violation of the U.S. Constitution.
According to newspaper reports, Texas had an estimated 571,000 black residents of voting age in the early 1940s. They were being shut out of all the primaries along with anyone else who was not white. The Supreme Court overturned the 1935 decision 8-1. Justice Owen J. Roberts was the sole dissenter. He stated that the decision indicated an intolerance for the decisions of earlier justices involved, quote, as assumption that knowledge and wisdom reside in us, which was denied our predecessors. It's sort of how time and human knowledge work.
Right? We should all be, theoretically, more knowledgeable than people who came before us because we have discovered more in the intervening years. That dissent is real weird to read, in my opinion. If you have filed taxes in the U.S., ever, in recent years, I should say, you've been asked to answer a question via a checkoff, which is, quote, do you want $3 of your federal tax to go to the Presidential Election Campaign Fund? That idea began with the Presidential Election Campaign Fund Act of 1966, though at the time, the opt-in was for $1, not $3. And that was initiated as a way to curb corrupt donation practices. The opening paragraph of that act reads, quote, in the past, political campaigns for the presidency and vice presidency have been financed generally through voluntary contributions by individuals and corporations. In some instances, devices have been perfected to disguise these voluntary contributions as trade or business expenses in order to obtain a tax deduction for the amounts involved. Each time one of these devices has been detected, Congress has acted to prevent its continuation. And conversely, each time Congress has acted, it has made campaign financing more difficult. Against this background, it has become increasingly clear that new methods of financing campaigns must be found.
The Presidential Election Campaign Fund Act set up a system where the taxes paid each year to the government, taxpayers can opt for a small amount to be placed into this presidential election campaign fund, quote, for the purposes of defraying expenses incurred by political parties in running candidates for president and vice president. Political parties could only get reimbursement payouts from the fund if their candidate, quote, receives at least 5 million votes in the preceding presidential election. But the new law was suspended in 1967 and then reintroduced in the Revenue Act of 1971, which is usually discussed in tandem with the next piece of legislation that we're talking about. This tax return opt-in was put into practice in 1973.
The Federal Election Campaign Act was passed into law in 1971, and it went into effect on April 7th, 1972. And this marks what is often considered the start of the modern era of campaign finance law because it did a lot. It also kicked off a decade of just constant back and forth about how campaign finances should work. The FECA required that all campaigns report all of their incoming and outgoing finances. It also laid out a lot of regulations for how PACs operated. One big change was that it enabled corporate entities, unions, etc., to put their own money into setting up and running PACs, and then the money that they collected through the PACs, which are also called separate segregated funds. If you ever see that, that means a political action committee's fund, could be donated to campaigns at the federal level. So they could pay for running the whole thing and then use all of the money people donated to give to candidates.
This led to a lot of problems because there wasn't any kind of regulatory agency or body that could really keep an eye on these rules. Once again, the implementation really couldn't keep up with the regulation. Compliance monitoring fell to the Clerk of the House, the Secretary of the Senate, and the Comptroller General of the United States General Accounting Office. All of those people had plenty of other duties. More than 7,000 instances of fraud or campaign finance abuse were brought before the Justice Department after the 1972 election. Almost none of them got to litigation.
Because nobody had the time. Watergate was the next big scandal that impacted campaign finance reform. So this is a quick, bare bones reminder on the complex layers of what happened there. 5 men were caught in June of 1972 breaking into the Democratic Party campaign offices in the Watergate complex. That was their second break-in. The first was in May, and during that break-in, they had already stolen documents related to the campaign, which they intended to use to get President Richard Nixon reelected. Nixon claimed to know nothing about the break-in and managed to stay out of the scandal long enough to get reelected. Then, an anonymous informant told Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post that the president and members of his staff absolutely knew about the break-in and that Nixon had paid the burglars to keep his name out of it. He had also tried to obstruct the investigation into the situation. Then, when it was discovered that Nixon taped all of his conversations in the Oval Office, the Supreme Court had to order him to turn those tapes over, and they provided evidence that Nixon had indeed been trying to cover up the break-in and his involvement in it. That is the shortest, least nuanced version of the Watergate scandal we can give you.
So this wasn't exactly an event tied to campaign finances, but it brought the issue of government corruption into really sharp focus and led to calls to tighten up regulatory efforts. Until this point, that had just been handled in a very catch-as-catch-can kind of way, even as various laws had been passed. This is a similar inflection point to the way that the Swartwout case had brought attention to the assessments that were being made against government workers' salaries that we talked about last time.
2 years after the Watergate story broke, the Federal Election Commission, FEC, was formed as part of a massive overhaul of the Federal Election Campaign Act. This amendment is sometimes referred to as a full rewrite, and that is because it did include a lot of changes, including providing for federal funds to go to presidential primary candidates and setting limits on both the spending and contributing sides of the ledger. It required disclosure of contributions, and it limited the amount a candidate could spend of their own money on their campaign. These regulations applied to anyone running for a federal office, and of course, as we said, it set up the FEC.
The FEC was established to round up the work that had been spread among multiple government offices as an extra duty. It made all of that the function of one oversight agency. That work included monitoring campaign funds and their reporting, writing regulations regarding those things, and the authority to oversee enforcement of the regulations. The 1974 amendments to the Federal Election Campaign Act set the nature of the commission's makeup. The Speaker of the House, the President pro tempore of the Senate, would each appoint 2 voting members, as would the president. The Secretary of the Senate and the Clerk of the House would also be on the commission, but they would not be voting members. That commission started its work officially on April 14th, 1975.
But the legislation that established the Federal Election Commission was legally challenged right after it was passed. And we're going to get into that case after we take a break to hear from the sponsors that keep the show going. In 1976, the Supreme Court heard the landmark case Buckley versus Vallejo, which challenged elements of the 1974 updates to campaign finance law. This case had been filed in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia by Senator James L. Buckley, a Republican from New York, and it was initially filed in January 1975. Buckley had become the primary leader in the charge that changes to the Federal Election Campaign Act were unconstitutional. Francis R. Vallejo, the named defendant representing the federal government, was the Secretary of the U.S. Senate and one of those non-voting FEC commissioners. After lower courts shifted the case around and then upheld the constitutionality of the regulations, Buckley appealed to the Supreme Court, and that appeal was filed on September 19, 1975, and the judgment was shared on January 30th, 1976.
The main argument in Buckley versus Vallejo was that the changes to the act were unconstitutional. Primarily, limitations on the use of money for political purposes were in violation of the First Amendment protections for free expression. Quote, since no significant political expression could be made without the expenditure of money. There were other points within the filing, including the complaint that there should be no limitations on the amounts of expenditures of volunteers made on campaigns. Basically, if somebody wanted to travel on their own expense to help the campaign or do anything else that cost money with no expectation of reimbursement, there should be no limit on it. And that limiting a candidate from spending as much of their own money as they wanted on a campaign was also unconstitutional.
This was a big case, and the court's decision on it was a mixed bag. Contribution ceilings were not in violation of the First Amendment, per the Supreme Court. In a 6-2 vote, the court upheld the limits as set down in the 1974 law, which were a $1,000 limit for individual contributions to a single candidate, a $5,000 limit on PAC contributions to a single candidate, and a $25,000 limit on individual contributions for a given year. So if you're like, wait, you just said 1,000. The idea was that if you were a person very flush with cash, you could donate, for example, $1,000 to 25 different people.
But when it came to spending on the part of a candidate, the court deemed the restrictions unconstitutional as it, quote, reduced the quantity of expression by restricting the number of issues discussed, the depth of the exploration, and the size of the audience reached. This is because virtually every means of communicating ideas in today's mass society requires the expenditure of money.
So yeah, if you're rich, spend as much as you want. Go ahead. As for the FEC creation and disclosure of contributions requirements, the court upheld those, although the nature of the selection of FEC officials was struck down. And that was because there was a little bit of a mismatch in power and appointment, because Congress appointed 4 of the commissioners, but they then had executive powers, which just didn't